Welcome back to Sex Crimes Defense Podcast with Chance and Jay. Chance Oberstein is a defense attorney who handles sex crimes in California. I'm a media professional. This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be legal advice. Chance, we were talking about Sean Diddy Combs, and I think you were going to talk about legal strategy of the trial.
Well, yeah, how did it evolve and how did it spin out of control? I think that's a good way of looking at this. Before we get into, you're wondering how Cassie comes into play here, and maybe we can do a cross comparison at some point, to other high-profile cases. But let's look at the evolution of the legal strategy. First, and foremost, there was an initial denial and settlement. So the Combs team initially dismissed Ventura's civil lawsuit in November of 2023 as a money grab and settled it within 24 hours, reportedly for about $20 million. The move was likely aimed at minimizing reputational damage and avoiding discovery. However, there's a shift now. The second part of the strategy is a shift to criminal defense, because after federal charges were filed in September of 2024, and that largely stemmed from uncovering, that's after the surfacing of the surveillance tape. The defense pivoted to a more aggressive posture, arguing that Combs was guilty of domestic violence, which is what you were talking about just a minute ago, but not of sex trafficking or racketeering. And then there was, following that, the concession strategy. Like during the trial, Combs' lawyers adopted a bold tactic. They conceded that he was a bad guy who had committed abusive acts, but argued that these did not meet the legal threshold for racketeering or coercive sex trafficking. And I think they were successful at that. Okay, and then targeting overreach, something that I spoke about earlier too. The defense portrayed the prosecution as overzealous, claiming the government had overcharged the case and failed to prove the existence of a criminal enterprise. And that's something that we were discussing just a moment ago, which is that you couldn't really understand why all this stuff was going on because they overcharged her, right?
They absolutely did. And I think what happens is you have what happens in trial, court, defense, prosecution. That happens in a vacuum because it's untouchable by anybody other than that legal process. Everybody else just watches but can't affect it, unless the jury gets tainted.
Right.
What's interesting about this case is, and that's when we end up with the kind of a social media trifecta, is people seem to agree fully with the outcome, which is what was the government talking about? Trying to charge him for this. And I think that's why we saw celebrations of baby oil being sprayed outside the courthouse and people wearing shirts saying Frico ain't a Rico and all this stuff. And now Sean Diddy Combs has the favor of the people again. He's the gladiator that gave the finger to the emperor, and he can go on this. I think he's going to see another round of mega success, assuming he handles things better. He does need to tone down the bad boy image a little.
I think that's what got him into trouble very much in the first place. And when you think about it and you think about what maybe got the prosecutors over the finish line, the federal prosecutors over the finish line, let's take a look at the impact of Cassie's testimony, because it's really interesting and it's something that you could learn from. So let's just take a look at that for a minute. You could stop me and ask me questions about it along the way, but let's take a look at some things that she was used by the prosecution to accomplish. First of all, emotional weight. Her testimony was raw and harrowing. She described years of abuse, coercion, and manipulation, including being forced into drug-fueled sex acts known as freak-offs with male escorts. And then the credibility and detail. She gave specific accounts of physical violence, including the 2016 hotel assault on surveillance video, which became a turning point in public perception to begin with. And then the cross-state conduct. This is what gets you into the federal prosecution. She testified that Combs arranged and paid for escorts to travel across state lines. directly supporting the charges of transportation to engage in prostitution. So she was central to that charge. Then look at the psychological control. She also put that out on the table. Her account of how Combs controlled her career, her appearance, and personal relationships helped establish a pattern of coercion and emotional abuse. And finally, civil versus criminal. Although the jury acquitted Combs of sex trafficking and racketeering, Ventura's testimony was instrumental in securing convictions on 2 counts of transportation for prostitution. So when you look at the civil and criminal divide, her testimony on the criminal end of it was pretty weighty. What do you think about that?
So, all right, well, my job is to say things that aren't popular. But I do believe that wealthy people that commit crimes of domestic violence, etc., are given a pass if they have enough money and celebrity. And I think you can apply, now that's really, really tough to swallow, but you can apply it to presidential candidates, other celebrities, other singers, musicians, athletes. This group that has lots of money and celebrity gets through this where normal people don't.
Well, typically, yeah. But Cassie, she's also a public figure. Okay, and this
really, not like he is.
Not like he is.
I'm just saying there
Not
will
like
be
he is.
people that'll never fully now if he had a underage sex charge, that's whole different. But if it's just domestic violence, I don't know why, but people give that a pass.
Well, let's take a look. Let's just look at this a little bit closer because it has to do with the strategic outcome here. The defense's gamble paid off partially, not wholly. He was acquitted of the most serious charge. He was acquitted of the most serious charges, but convicted of lesser ones. But legal analysts called it a tactical win for the defense, though he still faces up to 20 years in prison. That doesn't seem so much of a win to me. Okay, he faces up to 20. Now, what he'll get, we don't know.
What's the minimum?
You know what? I don't know.
I feel like I heard it's 4.
Don't know what it is, but it's still time in prison. Okay, and Ventura's testimony, while not enough to secure convictions on all counts, was widely seen by most analysts as a landmark moment in holding powerful figures accountable. And that's why I think it's worthwhile to probably compare this to other cases, because if you look at other cases, it probably is true.
Well, I'll switch hats. Let me set down my total pessimism hat, which I've been wearing most of this podcast. And I'll pick up the pro victim. Cassie Ventura suffered such different levels of abuse at such an extreme that he deserves prison just for what he did to her.
Well, see, you're getting into the head of the jurors, and if they can latch on to something to do that, they did, because I think that testimony is what impacted this trial.
Now, isn't there, wasn't there somebody that died that he supposedly, some lady, do you know anything about that?
No.
All right. Oh, we won't get into that. But the thing is, I will say this, around Diddy revolves so many different allegations, theories. I mean, again, his kids and people that have worked for him and all the... let's just talk about freak-offs for a second. I want to say this, is that one of the things about freak-offs that I believe is that everybody wanted to be there until it was found out that it was a crime scene, and now nobody wants to be remembered as being there.
Well, isn't that kind of like human nature?
There you go. And human nature has no place in the legal process.
But yet it's there.
Well, of course it is. And
it's there, and it's there big time.
And we're asking the jury to set aside your understanding of humanity, aren't we?
Well, in a way, yeah, because we're not talking about humanity. We're talking about what's legally sufficient, but jurors still bring in their own points of view, and that is humanity.
It's interesting how Cassie Ventura, without that surveillance footage, without her testimony, without what she experienced, this may not he Diddy might still be running around making records, having freak-offs.
Well, that's that's a good point, and I think if you look at several high-profile cases, you could see you can see the center of impact. Like what you just described was coercion, drug-fueled sex acts, and emotional control. Of course, it helped secure convictions on the lesser charges. Of course, it did. It pulled right at the strings. But if you look at other things, like look at the R. Kelly trial, you had multiple survivors. They were the key witnesses, and they gave graphic accounts of abuse and manipulation that led to racketeering and sex trafficking convictions. Or let's take the Weinstein case. You had women testimony, women testifying, which focused on rape and intimidation, and they helped to establish a pattern of predatory behavior. What about Larry Nassar? Over 150 gymnasts. They were the key witnesses. And it was survivor impact statements that were central to sentencing and public reckoning. Public reckoning, that is humanity. Okay? And Bill Cosby, of course. Andrea Costan. Her testimony was pivotal in securing a conviction despite years of legal setbacks. But what sets Ventura apart from all those? Think about it. She testified while she was 8 months pregnant, adding emotional gravity. Her account included surveillance footage, which corroborated the physical abuse. She described how abuse became a job, orchestrating freak-offs under threat, blurring lines between victim and coerced facilitator. And her testimony sparked broader conversations about coercive control, celebrity impunity, and survivor credibility. I mean, think about that.
So I think you might have just been leading us into legal takeaway. What I'm hearing is, if you've got a survivor with deep impact and you can lay out the details, plus if there's any legal evidence to help corroborate what they're saying, this is how you drive the stake into the case.
It appears so, and it was done very well, and that's what fueled the verdict on the lesser charges. But if we're going to examine this, let's examine it. Let's talk about what went wrong, what went right, what was the how did the strategy work in this case, one way or the other. And I'm sure that that's leading up to a third episode, but I don't know.
I'd say it is. All right. Thanks so much for joining us here on Sex Crimes Defense Podcast. Join us for part 3, where Chance discusses more about the legal strategy and ramifications.